Okay, let me move this away. So what a treat to be with Salvation Army folks about 3 years ago. You can see, first of all, there's a film crew in my house because the book, Forging a Sacred Weapon, will also have a documentary that goes along with it, which is really powerful because some people don't read books. So a film will be really advantageous. So anyway, when I was in New Zealand visiting Colin Daly, which I'm sure a lot of you know, about 3 years ago, I got to speak the very first night I was there for 3.5 hours at the Salvation Army headquarters. And then the head of the headquarters invited me back again the next day for another 1.5 hour conversation. So this is great follow up. Plus the Reformation Project had about 5 Salvation Army pastors, mostly in Canada, join us for Pastors in Process about a month ago. So I'm really delighted to be with you. So let me explain to you the work that I've been doing recently. So as was mentioned, I wrote a book a few years ago, Walking the Bridges Canyon. And I just went back this morning to see what I said about the RSV. And really all I knew at the time was the RSV, the Revised Standard Version, was the first version of the Bible that included the word homosexual. Well, I am pretty good with history and context. That's all my teaching is. I want to understand history and context. I want to understand the roles of males and females. I want to understand where the Bible fits into that, how we understand our bodies, all of those things in context of history. Because if we look back at the verses that were written 3,400 years ago and 2,000 years ago with our 21st century brains, we all know that doesn't work. So I knew that when this word was included in 1946, there was no theology associated with what it was to be homosexual. And there was also very little understanding about what it was to be homosexual. So at this time in 1946, homosexuality was thought to be certainly a sexual deviation, a perversion, and in some of this time, even a crime in the United States. And we're going to concentrate on the United States because that's where the RSV was translated. So I would teach, and I would teach along a timeline, and I would say, assuming, knowing what I did about history, that when this translation team decided to include the word homosexual, to take arsenokoitai and malakoi, first to combine them, and then to translate them as the word homosexual, my strong, good, informed assumption was that it was ideological and cultural and not theological translation. So, but I couldn't prove it. At that point, I couldn't prove it. So when I wrote about it in the first book, it was kind of a mention, and it's really funny to now know how important that was and how that happened and how I kind of glossed through it, and now it's going to be an entire book. So I was teaching, I teach these 8-hour workshops. And the second time I was teaching a particular 8-hour workshop in this church community in California, this guy named Ed, I'm going to share my screen. And are you getting Ed here? Can you see Ed?
Not yet.
Okay, wait 1 second. I gotta make sure I get this. Oh, here we go. Can you see Ed there? Share. Can you see him? Nothing
Yes.
happened?
Yes,
Yes?
we can.
Okay, great. Okay, so Ed, he came to my workshop. He was in his late 40s at the time. He had gone to Talbot Seminary. He was a missionary in Japan. He was a youth pastor, and he was closeted. Well, he knew he was gay, but he couldn't bring it up in his American Baptist church. So he came to my seminar. The first time it impacted him, but by partway through the second one, I could see him sitting in the room crying, and I knew something was happening in him. And he said afterwards, I think what you're saying is the truth. That's good, right? And so I'm going to stop sharing it there. I'm not proficient at this yet. Stop sharing. Okay. So we became friends. And Ed is a financial planner, and he had the money to go out and kind of prove what I was saying, that the Bible didn't include the word homosexual until the RSV. So he went out and he bought a lot of Bibles. And so we started this collection of buying all kinds of Bibles, some from the 1500s, some and lexicons and dictionaries. And he's now amassed about a $1,500 collection of Bibles. It's a beautiful, huge library because he was very serious about proving this too. And he wanted to make sure that these texts were preserved and available to the public. And then he told me about this at one conference that I was speaking at, and he invited me to come see his collection. So it was, come up and see my Bible collection sometime. I couldn't resist. So I went back to his house in Southern California. He lives in Long Beach. And I was so fascinated that somebody was as interested in as I was in word history. So we became friends. And I knew that the translation team was headed by a man named Luther Weigel, and that he was the head of this team, and he was a dean of Yale Divinity. And so when he died, all of his archive materials stayed at Yale University. But I didn't know that part. So Ed took it the next step further. And he called me one day and he said, all of Luther Weigel's papers are at Yale Archives. Would you like to go? So in September of 2018, we went and we spent 5 days at Yale University on 94 boxes of papers. So here we are. We went to Yale. Let me show the screen. 1 second. Where's the share? There it is. Again, oh, this is complicated. Yes. So you can see, can you see this screen? Yes?
Yes, we can. This is
Thank
the third.
So this gentleman here is Luther Weigel, and it was a team of about 12 men, and they were the ones that worked from 1929 with a brief stop during the Depression until 1946 when the New Testament of the RSV came out. And they worked on the translation. They worked with the American Standard Version, the English Standard Version, and the King James, and the original Greek and Hebrew. And they voted on how are we going to present this new translation. Their point was to have a modern version of the Bible. That's what they were trying to create. And they were a very academic and diverse group, but they were really good academics. So there they are. And we went through 94 boxes of notes in the Yale archives. As I said, we spent 5 days there. And then we also didn't know beforehand that there were also 22 rolls of microfilms associated with his papers. So we went through the 22 rolls of microfilm too. And in all, we went through 60,000 sheets of documents. Now, what surprised us was a few things. Nobody had ever gone through the entire archives before. So it would seem a really logical question to me that if somebody were going to wonder why this team put the word homosexual in the Bible, somebody would have gone into these archives to try to read the notes, the contemporaneous notes to the time they were doing the work, to find out what the discussion was, like, what do we understand arsenic koitai to mean? What do we understand malakoi to mean? Should we combine them? And what is the modern word that would translate the meaning of this verse? But there were no notes from the time the work was done. We did find out that the work on 1 Corinthians, where the word first appears in the Bible, homosexual, and it appears in this verse. Again, share screen. Oh, gosh. So it appears in this, let's see, here we have it in, let's go into here. Well, in the previous versions, it had been the effeminate nor abusers of mankind, the effeminate nor abusers of mankind again, the catamite nor sodomite. And now it's going to appear, those words are going to be translated together. And the New Testament of the Bible came out in 1946, and it says, homosexuals shall not enter the kingdom of heaven. So But as we were going through the verses, we couldn't find why they did it. It just happened. There was no vote on it. But we did find out that the book of First Corinthians, the work on that book was actually done between 1935 and 1937. It was finalized in 1941, and no one went back and considered it. So now I had to go back yet another decade and say, what did we understand as people of faith? And also, what did the medical community understand about what a homosexual was between 1935 and 1937? Nothing. At that point, it was a mental illness, and not quite a crime yet, but a mental illness. So I was set back yet another 10 years. We were very discouraged because we couldn't find any notes as to why they did this. So we kept going through the archives for afterwards. And on the third day that I was going through the archives, I found a letter. I found a series of letters, and nobody had ever found these letters before. Nobody. So as the screen was, you can see that letter? Yes, hopefully. As the screen was coming by, I saw for the first time in 60,000 sheets of paper, the word homosexual. And so I stopped it. I stopped what we were doing. I called Ed on over, and I said, I think I found something. So we started recording right then. And I'm going to go to the next sheet because I really don't want you to see the whole letter yet. And so we read through this letter. It took us about 35 minutes on recording to read through this letter from one person to the head of the translation team. Then the head of the translation team responded back to the letter writer. And then the letter writer responded back to the translation team. And then one more. So there were four letter exchanges. There were 13 pages, and so we had this exchange, and it was written in 1959, and the date is important. This letter was written October 22nd, 1959, and the letter writer is a person, we're not giving his last name yet, but a person named David S. And he said to the head of the translation team, Dr. Weigel, now this is 7 years after the full book came out. The full RSV came out in 1952. So this is 7 years later. We have not found any letters about anybody questioning this translation. And they kept everything. So we knew these archives were really full. And Dr. Weigel, so this letter writer, David, writes a 3-page, single-spaced, really good letter defending theologically, mostly, why this word shouldn't be homosexual. And then he says at one point, I know some people that are homosexuals, and this is not who they are. And if you continue to use this word homosexual as you're going through, if you don't correct this, he says, I write this letter after many months of serious thought. And at one point, then he says, you can see part of the letter, he says, but basically, if you don't correct this mistranslation he believed in 1 Corinthians 6, 9 through 10, the Bible is going to be used as a sacred weapon, not in fact for the purification of the church, but for injustice against a defenseless minority group, which includes sincere, convicted, and spiritually reborn Christian who has discovered himself to be of homosexual inclination from the time of his memory. I write this letter with certain homosexual individuals in mind. Christians, I love this part, Christians who would die for their faith, their church, and I'm reading through this, and their Lord, but who cannot alter their biological state of being. And he says, I hope you're going to pay attention. When I read that, I thought, knowing what I know about the culture of the time, this guy had to be gay. He had to be a homosexual himself. So we found this exchange. And in the second letter where Dr. Weigel writes back, he says, you know, you're right. And he actually says in the letter he writes back to David in response, we made a mistake. These two words combined do not mean homosexual, and they do not mean what we understand. Now it's 1959, 20 years after the original work was done. This is not who homosexuals are. So they go back and forth in the next letter. And Dr. Weigel says, how about if we make this translation, those who participate in homosexual practices? And David says, no, that's not what it means. It's those who indulge in homosexual vices. Now, the word vices at the time had a connotation of abuse, of rape. So David is saying, no, it doesn't mean people that participate in same-sex behavior. It's people that participate in imposing themselves on another person, a vice, a crime of rape. So Dr. Weigel then says, okay, you know what? I'm going to take your recommendation and I'm going to put it in the file. And the next time we go to do a revision, we are going to look at your suggestions. Well, the reason this date is very important is because the translation committee had gotten together in June of 1959 for 9 days in Chicago, and they reviewed 300 text suggestions people had written in over the 7 years and said, you made a mistake here, you didn't put a comma here, you misspelled here. So they took 300 really good suggestions and corrections, and they spent 9 days going through it, and they made the corrections. And by agreement with the publisher of the RSV, they were not to make any more changes for 10 years, sign on the dotted line. That would be 1969. So on October 1st, 1959, they made an agreement with the publisher, Thomas Nelson and Sons, to make no more revisions to the RSV until 1969. So we can then go forward to the notes when the RSV team got together again in 1965 to look at this verse. They deferred correction. 1968, they deferred correction. But in the margin on the side of this, consider 1 Corinthians 6 through 9, it said 13 pages. There are 13 pages associated with that we should discuss before we do this revision. And that's the exchange between David and the head of the translation team. No other letters had come into the translation team telling them that they'd made a mistake. This was a non-issue because homosexuality at this time was a mental illness and a crime. So of course those people don't make it into heaven. Well, neither do thieves and killers and murderers and drunkards and adulterers, these people that are doing all kinds of wrong things. And it's going to be just this period of time when we're going to find out it's just a normal part of human sexuality. So then we see in 1969, the team is looking at these two suggestions: those who participate in homosexual practices and those who participate in those who indulge in homosexual vices. And you know what the team, you know which one the team decided to go with about homosexuals? Neither. Because by 1969, they started to have a clue that homosexuals were people that had a different kind of attraction. Stonewall had already happened. Gay rights were starting to happen. And they decided as a translation team to make it those who participate, sexual perverts. And as far as I'm aware, I think heterosexuals can participate in sexual perversions. So whereas one translation of the Bible, it was about a behavior before the RSV, then it became about a particular type of person, no longer a behavior. And now they're trying to switch it back to a behavior. But unbelievably problematically, several translations of the Bible had already started and the work was begun on them. Like the NIV, the work was started in 1956. It was supposed to be the conservative Bible, the antidote to this very liberal RSV. So they started work in 1956. The New American Standard Bible and then the Living Bible Paraphrase, they all used the 1952 RSV with the word homosexual in there as their base text. And why do I know this? Because Ed and I have gone and looked at the translation notes of all those Bibles. And every single one of them used the RSV. Well, by the time any one of them came out, the RSV team already knew they had made a mistake and they were planning on doing a correction, but they didn't do the correction because the correction by contract couldn't happen until after 1969. So in the 1971 RSV-r, the first revision, it says the word homosexual. So this, I think, where am I? I pushed my timer wrong. So am I at the end? Can somebody tell me, am I at the end? Do I have any minutes left?
Another 4 minutes.
Oh, good. Okay. So we went and we looked at the living Bible. That's my dog. It's okay. Come here, puppy. Isn't he beautiful? He's barking at a cameraman. So we went to Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois, and we looked at the Living Bible translation, Kenneth Taylor's paraphrase, and he went right to the RSV. We did the same thing with the New American Standard Bible, no commentary on any kind of theological conversation about this. And I saw the NIV notes also at Wheaton. Those are housed at Wheaton. 60 something boxes we went through. We've really done the work of going and looking at translation notes. And the mistake was made. The RSV team knew in 1959 that they had made a mistranslation, a translation error. It was, nothing was done in malice. There's no malice attached to this. It was just their understanding of the time of what homosexual was, what homosexuality was. Not good understanding. But when they started to understand 20 years after the work, they were totally willing to do the correction, but the correction was already a bad copy in several other translations. So, so the work we're doing, the book that I'm writing right now, so Forging a Sacred Weapon, it follows the roles, the male and female roles through history, how we've understood our bodies, how those verses apply in context of the time, how they were used over time to talk about non-procreative, excessive lust behavior. And then when this happens in 1946, I want you to fully understand what that translation team understood about homosexuality in 35 to 37, what they understood about it in 46, what they understood about it in the 50s. And you can see that there really was no malice. The people that led this team were good theologians, good people. I mean, when you read the book, you're going to fall in love with the head of the translation team, really good, humble man. And so much humility that when a young man said to him, "You made a translation error," he could hear that. Well, 11 months after we found this letter, we set one of our friends to try to find him. And let me show you to him. And this is the last thing I'll say to you for a while. In 11 months after finding the letter, one of our little sleuth friends found him. His name is David, middle name, last name. He wrote the letter in 1959. Oops. Yeah, I am sharing it. In 1959, under his first and middle name, he wrote it from a P.O. box in Canada. And through miracles, it's just only miracles that we found that letter and only miracles that we found him. He is gay. He went on to be a pastor for 37 years, 9 pastorates within the United Church of Canada. 23 of those years, he had a partner that went from pastorate to pastorate with him that everybody thought was his sickly cousin Joe that he was taking care of. Shh. And so when we found him, I called him on the phone when we found him. After 60 years, nobody had talked to him about this letter. He had never shared the copy of the letter. He didn't know the impact of his letter. He didn't even know his letter was going to change the revision to sexual perverts. He had no idea. And we brought him to a conference a year after we found him. And at the age of 80, he came out as a gay man. And he's in the documentary, he's in the book, and it's the most fascinating story. So that's all I've got to say. No, it's not all I have to say. I have a lot more to say, but that's all you get today.
Thank you very much, Kathy. And I'm sure we would all love to sit here all night and listen to everything you've got to say. And I'm sure we can't see the attendees, but I'm sure they're all clapping. That was a fantastic piece of research and a wonderful story. And I think we're all looking forward to reading the book, watching the documentary.